Egyptian scribes had a fraction that never worked, 6 pieces, stacked one on top of the other, but add them all together, and the total still isn't one whole.
Not a mistake. Nobody caught in 4,000 years. A gap they wrote down on purpose.
The shape is the Eye of Horus torn apart in the fight for a throne, and the one credited with putting it back together isn't Horus, it's Thoth, the god whose eye is the moon, not the sun, the eye that works precisely where the other one can't see.
I didn't meet that fraction in a book first, I met it after 11 nights of tracing the same shape in the dark, and a 12th night that was not nothing at all.
On the 12th night, the pressure didn't spike and fade, it held, and I had the unmistakable, specific sense of being watched. I was being seen by one.
12 nights isn't even a third of 40. Whatever answered didn't answer because I'd earned it.
This is what closes a 4,000-year-old gap that arithmetic alone was never built to close.
Egyptian scribes had a fraction that never worked. Half plus a quarter plus an eighth plus a 16th plus a 32nd plus a 64th. 6 fractions stacked one on top of the other in the same official notation used to measure grain and land and time. Add all 6 together and the total still isn't one whole. It comes to 63 64ths. Forever, not a mistake nobody caught in 4,000 years, a gap they kept writing down on purpose, because whatever closed it was never supposed to be arithmetic's job. I didn't meet that fraction in a book first. I met it after 11 nights of tracing the same simple shape in the dark, in the same spot, at the same hour, and feeling next to nothing worth mentioning, and a 12th night that was not nothing at all. I want to tell you what that fraction is a picture of, why an Egyptian god is the one credited with closing it, and what opened for me on the night I stopped expecting anything to. By the time we get there, you'll understand why the Egyptians who wrote that gap down never believed a ritual could complete itself just by being repeated enough times, and why that turned out to matter more to me than the sensation itself did. Before any of that, touch the space between your eyebrows for a second. Not hard. Just notice, without deciding in advance what you should feel, whether there's anything there right now. Keep that in the back of your mind. We're coming back to it. I'm not going to tell you that feeling something there right now proves anything. Most nights, for 11 nights running, I felt next to nothing there myself, and that turned out to matter as much as the night I finally did. The shape is the Eye of Horus, Wedjat. The Egyptians called it the Whole One. In the myth, it's damaged in the fight between Horus and his uncle Seth, torn apart in the struggle for the throne of Egypt. And the one credited with putting it back together isn't Horus. It's Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, measurement, and the moon, standing just outside the fight, doing the work neither combatant could do for himself. Egyptologist George Hart, in his Routledge Dictionary of Egyptian Gods and Goddesses, documents something specific about why it has to be Thoth and not, say, Ra. Thoth was never the sun's eye. He was the moon's, the eye that works precisely when the other one can't see. That's not incidental to a ritual performed at night, in the dark, on purpose. It's the whole reason the myth assigns the repair to him instead of to daylight, or to Horus simply trying harder. Here's the part almost nobody who talks about the Eye of Horus mentions. The 6 fractions I opened with weren't poetry. Egyptian scribes used them as an actual system of measurement, grain, land, time, divided in halves and quarters and eighths, all the way down to a 64th, each fraction literally drawn as a different part of the eye's outline. It's attested in scribal papyri going back to the Old and Middle Kingdoms, real bureaucratic notation borrowed from a myth about a god putting a torn eye back together. And the myth's own math doesn't close. Half, quarter, eighth, 16th, 32nd, 64th, sum every fraction the eye is divided into. and you get 63 64ths. Egyptian tradition says the missing 64th isn't found. It's supplied by Thoth and only by Thoth through something the texts call magic rather than measurement. I'm going to ask you to hold a question through the next several minutes because I don't have a clean answer for it yet. If a 4,000-year-old system built specifically to measure precision admits, in its own official notation, that a piece is always missing, what does that mean for anyone who thinks doing a nightly practice for a set number of days is what closes a gap like that? Geraldine Pinch, in Egyptian mythology, traces how central this single repair became to the whole civilization. The restored eye, the Wedjat, turns up everywhere, carved into amulets worn by the living, painted onto the sides of coffins facing east so the dead could keep seeing. It became shorthand for made whole again in a culture that had no interest in pretending injury hadn't happened. The eye isn't a symbol of never being torn. It's a symbol of being torn and then completed anyway, completed by someone other than the one who did the tearing and other than the one who was torn. Pinch also notes something Egyptologists rarely translate into plain language. The eye wasn't restored quietly, off to the side of the myth. It became the standard unit temple reliefs used to depict the act of offering itself. Priests are shown presenting the eye, not bread or wine, as the base symbol of what a complete gift even looks like. A myth about repair became the civilization's working definition of what it means to give something whole. That distinction sat with me longer than the myth itself did, because it's not really a story about an eye. It's a story about what a wound needs after the part you can do yourself runs out. I built the practice myself out of two things. I'll walk through exactly how in a few minutes, and the rule I set for it was simple. Same time, every night, lying down, eyes closed, and a slow trace of the eye's outline in the air a few inches above my forehead, right at the point between the eyebrows, held there with attention while my breathing slowed. The first night, I felt a faint warmth and told myself that was probably just blood moving toward my hand. The second night, nothing. The third, nothing. By night 7, I was negotiating with myself in the dark. One more week, and if nothing changes, I'll admit this was never going to work for me the way it seems to work for other people. By night 11, the negotiation had gotten quieter and more honest. I wasn't afraid this was fake. I was afraid it was real, and I'd stop one night too early to find out. 11 nights of that particular kind of nothing is its own experience worth naming because nobody talks about it. Most of what gets made about opening anything skips straight from I started to and then something happened, as if the 11 nights of feeling foolish in the dark don't count as part of the practice. They were the actual practice. The 12th night was something else. On the 12th night, halfway through the trace, the pressure between my eyebrows didn't behave like it had on any of the previous 11. It didn't spike and fade the way a stray sensation does when you're concentrating hard enough to manufacture one. It held, and then it thickened, a tightness that started to pull faint tingling up through both arms, the kind of sensation that makes you check, almost against your will, whether you imagined it, except it kept going while you were checking. For one exact stretch of seconds, the sensation had a texture I have never been able to describe as internal. It didn't feel like something I was generating by trying hard enough. It felt like something arriving from outside the effort, and for that stretch, I had the unmistakable, specific sense of being watched, not vaguely, precisely, the way you know before you turn around that someone in a room is looking directly at you. I'll say one more thing about that tingling before moving past it, because I don't want to leave it sitting there unexamined. Robert Bruce, who spent decades cataloging threshold sensations that precede deeper states of perception in his book, Astral Dynamics, documents almost exactly that pattern. Tightness, tingling, localized warmth building right before something shifts, described by practitioners with no connection to Egypt, Hermeticism, or anything I was doing. I'm not claiming a shared mechanism between his tradition and mine. I'm noting that what I felt wasn't an isolated invention of my own nervous system on one strange night. The pattern isn't unique to me, even if what caused it, for me, still is. Every other time in my life, something like that had happened, and it had, twice before, colder both times, and faster. Nothing like this, in circumstances I won't get into here. My instinct was to flinch, open my eyes, break the moment before I had to find out what it was. This time I didn't. I finished the trace slowly, kept my eyes shut, and let the pressure hold instead of pulling away from it. And instead of building past what I could stay with, or vanishing the way every other night's sensation had vanished, it steadied, held its shape for several more seconds, and then receded on its own, at its own pace, like it had finished doing whatever it came to do. The oldest text in the entire Hermetic tradition opens with almost exactly that description. Not a god appearing to a hero mid-battle, but an ordinary man whose senses had already gone quiet. In the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, the one called Poimandres, Hermes Trismegistus describes his own body as bound, as if in a deep sleep, the moment before a towering presence, Poimandres, the mind of sovereignty, appears and begins showing him the structure of reality itself. As translated by Brian Copenhaver in the Standard Cambridge edition, Hermes doesn't receive that vision while wide awake, reasoning his way toward it. He receives it in a state where ordinary perception has already stepped aside. That's the founding scene of the entire tradition I was drawing this practice from, and it isn't a technique for forcing a vision. It's a description of a threshold state that has to be entered, not manufactured. Whatever visited Hermes didn't arrive because he worked hard enough at seeing it. It arrived once the part of him that does ordinary seeing had gone still. Plotinus, 3 centuries later, describes something structurally similar in the Enneads. The soul doesn't reach the one by more reasoning, more discursive thought stacked on more thought. It reaches it by a mode of attention that suspends the reasoning altogether. 2 different philosophers, writing centuries apart, in a tradition that treats the ordinary run of the mind not as the tool that gets you there, but as the noise that has to quiet down first. I'm not claiming what happened to me on the 12th night was a vision on the scale of Poimandres. I'm saying the state I was cultivating, lying still, senses quieted, not forcing anything to appear, is the same state this entire tradition names as the precondition, not the technique itself, 20 centuries before I ever traced an eye in the dark. That's also, I think, why Corpus Hermeticum Eye and a Cold War physics lab end up circling the same territory 2,000 years apart in completely different vocabularies. Hermes calls it the nous, a way of knowing that reason alone can't reach. A physicist, a few minutes from now, is going to call it something else entirely. I don't think they're describing 2 different things. There's a version of this question a physicist would ask differently, and I think it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved off as poetry dressed up as science. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have spent decades developing what's called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, the proposal that quantum processes occurring inside microtubules, structures inside neurons, contribute to how consciousness arises in the first place, and that specific, orchestrated collapses of those quantum states may correspond to moments of sudden, non-ordinary perception. It remains genuinely contested inside physics and neuroscience, not settled, not fringe, argued both directions in peer-reviewed venues for decades. I want to be precise about what that theory does and doesn't do for me. Penrose and Hameroff do not prove that 40 nights of a ritual changes anything at the quantum level of a human nervous system. Nobody has run that experiment, and I'm not aware of anyone claiming to. What their work does is keep a real, still open scientific question alive, whether consciousness carries a quantum layer at all, and whether a sustained, repeated state of attention could, even in principle, interact with it. There's a second independent line I want to set next to that one, from a completely different field with no citation history connecting the two. Russell Targ was one of the physicists who ran the Stanford Research Institute's formal, government-funded remote viewing program starting in 1972. Research published at the time in Nature and the Proceedings of the IEEE, studying whether human perception could carry information about a distant target with no ordinary sensory channel available to explain it. The findings remain genuinely debated. I'm not asking you to accept them as settled fact. I'm pointing out that a serious research institution spent years asking, with instruments and formal protocol, essentially the same question I was asking with a ritual in the dark. Can perception reach further than the ordinary senses account for? A theoretical physicist proposing a quantum mechanism for consciousness, and a different physicist running formal government experiments on non-local perception, two fields that have never sighted each other, arriving from opposite directions at the same open door. I want to be exact about what I'm claiming when I put those two next to Poimandres and an Egyptian myth about a missing fraction. I'm not saying any of this proves the other, that a physics hypothesis and a Cold War research program validate an Egyptian ritual, or that the ritual validates them. I'm saying something more precise, that four completely independent traditions with no reason to have influenced each other all describe the same shape, a mode of perception that exists past the edge of what ordinary attention reaches, and that none of them can be switched on by force. I know what the skeptical version of you is doing with that paragraph right now, lining the four up and asking whether stacking unrelated sources next to each other is actually evidence of anything, or just pattern matching dressed up convincingly. It's a fair instinct, and I'm not asking you to drop it. I'm asking you to notice that I'm not using the stack as proof of what happened to me on night 12. I'm using it to show you that the question I was sitting with in the dark isn't a fringe question. Serious people in serious institutions in completely unrelated centuries keep landing on some version of it. Which brings me back to the fraction I opened with, because I think it's actually the sharpest version of the same question, and it's the one I keep coming back to on the nights nothing happens. Most of what gets made about opening anything treats the opening as a switch, a technique, a breath pattern, a number of days, and then it's done, guaranteed, if you did the steps correctly. My reading of the Egyptian material says something different. The scribe's own notation for the eye never sums to a whole number. There is always a documented, official, on-purpose piece that measurement alone cannot supply. I don't read that as a flaw the Egyptians failed to notice for 4,000 years. I read it as the myth telling you in its own arithmetic that the practice was never going to complete itself through repetition alone. When I read that Thoth is the one who closes the 64th, most people treat that as a decorative detail of ancient math. For me, it reads as an instruction about practice itself. You can do the 40 64ths of the work yourself, every single night with exact discipline, and still need something that doesn't come from the repetition, that reframes what night 12 actually was. It wasn't a reward I earned by reaching some threshold of consistency. It wasn't proof my technique had finally gotten good enough. 12 nights isn't even a third of 40. My thesis is that the ritual is the 64th I could actually offer, the part measurable by showing up, and whatever happens after that, if anything happens at all, was never mine to schedule in advance. Night 12 didn't reward my consistency, it interrupted it. I know that sounds like I'm making the practice smaller instead of bigger, like I just told you the ritual doesn't really do anything. I don't think that's the same claim. The fraction you can offer isn't decoration. It's the only part any of us actually control in any spiritual practice, in any tradition, ever. The Egyptians didn't consider 40 64ths worthless just because it wasn't the whole number. They wrote it down as real, measured work. They just refused to lie about what it added up to on its own. Here is exactly what I did in full because I think the how matters more than the mythology if you're actually going to try it yourself. I want to be completely clear about one thing first. This is not a reconstruction of an ancient Egyptian temple ritual. No papyrus describes these 5 steps. I built this myself out of 2 things. The way Hermes describes his own senses going quiet before Poimandres appears, and the way the Eye of Horus in the myth was never completed by measurement alone. I call it the opening trace, and it's mine, not something I'm claiming Thoth handed down. 5 steps, nothing exotic, nothing that requires an altar or an object you don't already own, just a room dark enough and 11 nights of patience most people give up on by night 4. Dumpelthing hampa have down. Lie down, eyes closed, and don't force sleep yet. You want to be settled, not drifting off. With your attention, not your finger, though you can hover a finger a few inches above your forehead if it helps you focus. Trace the simple outline of an eye slowly in the air over the space between your eyebrows. Breathe slowly through the whole trace and notice, without expecting anything specific, where the sensation tends to gather. For most people, including me, that's a light pressure or warmth right at that point between the brows. If anything does arise, pressure, warmth, the sense of being observed, don't react to it immediately. This is the step that took me 11 nights to actually learn. Stay still, finish the gesture slowly, and only afterward let whatever you noticed circulate and settle on its own before you move. One honest exception: if anything ever feels like real distress and not just unfamiliar sensation, there is nothing weak about opening your eyes. Nothing about this practice depends on pushing through fear, only on not mistaking the ordinary flinch for a reason to stop. The instinct to flinch, to check, to open your eyes and break the moment is automatic. Overriding it once, deliberately, when what you're feeling is unfamiliar rather than alarming, is most of what the 40 nights are actually training. And before you actually fall asleep, take one real breath, move your hands and feet slightly, and bring your attention back into the room on purpose. Close the circuit consciously, instead of letting sleep swallow the end of it for you. What you're doing energetically is holding attention at a single point until the body's habitual scatter narrows there instead. Most nights, that shows up as a small local contraction that fades quickly, nothing dramatic. What made the 12th night different wasn't that the contraction was bigger. It's that instead of fading the way it had for 11 straight nights, it held its shape and then briefly expanded, arriving with a quality that didn't feel like it was being generated by my own concentration in that moment. That difference is worth learning to name for yourself, because I don't think you should take my word for what a sensation like that means. Here's the test I've come to trust, and I'd rather teach it to you directly than leave you guessing. If you have to strain to manufacture a feeling, that's very likely imagination doing exactly what imagination does under expectation. Nothing wrong with that, just worth knowing. If instead you stay genuinely still, without forcing anything, and something arrives on its own terms, unprompted, with a texture that doesn't match ordinary concentration, that's the distinction actually worth learning to notice night after night more than any single dramatic result is. Before the 12th night, I measured whether the practice was working by whether something visible happened. I don't anymore. Somewhere in those 11 nights of nothing, without noticing exactly when, I stopped measuring my own spiritual seriousness by results and started measuring it by whether I kept showing up in the dark regardless of what answered. That's the actual shift, not the sensation. What I did with 11 nights that gave me nothing to show for themselves. The pressure on night 12 did not grow the way fear grows, and it did not fade the way concentration fades once you stop trying. It held itself from somewhere I was not generating it from. The sense of being watched was not vague, and it was not metaphorical. For one exact stretch of seconds, I was not tracing an eye in the dark anymore. I was being seen by one. If you've ever kept something going with no sign it was reaching anywhere, you already know the only question that matters isn't whether something answers, it's whether you're still there, still tracing, on the night it does. I still don't know with certainty whether what met me on night 12 was Thoth specifically, the moon eye the myth says answers where the sun eye can't, or something in my own energetic structure finally responding for the first time in a measurable way to 11 nights of the same repeated offering. I've turned that question over since, and I'm not going to pretend the ritual handed me a clean answer to it. What I can say, examining it as carefully as I know how, it wasn't ordinary fear. Though fear was present, it had a specific shape and a specific direction, not the formless kind. It wasn't intuition either, the fast stitching together of things I already half knew. It arrived as a direct physical sensation, localized, not a thought. It fits what I'd call parapercepsum more precisely than either of those, a texture I recognized in the moment as not entirely generated by me. Whether that texture originated from a presence outside me or from my own system crossing a threshold it hadn't crossed before 11 nights of preparation. I'm leaving that open on purpose, rather than naming it more certainly than I actually know. What I don't leave open is the 64th. Night 12 wasn't a prize for showing up 12 times. 12 nights isn't even a third of 40. Whatever answered didn't answer because I'd finally earned it through consistency. The myth never promised that arithmetic would close on its own, and neither did I. 4 nights passed, a third of the way through something I'd committed to finishing regardless. I don't know yet whether the sensation comes back on later nights, or what I do differently if it doesn't, or if it does. I'm still inside the 40, not done with them. If you try tracing this yourself, type traced when you start. I read every one, and I want to know what night, if any, changes for you, because right now I only have data on mine.